I'm 23 years old now, but the memories of that weekend camping trip when I was 19 still haunt me. I had always loved nature, and the idea of spending time alone in the wilderness seemed like the perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. Little did I know that what seemed like a peaceful getaway would turn into a nightmare. I remember it all so clearly the day I decided to go solo camping in a secluded part of the forest. I had heard about this spot from a friend who claimed it was the perfect place to relax and disconnect from everything. It was deep in the woods, far from any civilization, and I was excited about the idea of having the whole place to myself. I didn't anticipate that the woods would be anything but serene. The drive to the campsite was long, but I didn't mind. The winding roads were lined with towering trees, and the fading light of the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting patterns of gold and amber on the road. It all felt so peaceful, like something out of a postcard. I passed through small towns with few houses, where the sound of birds and wind was all you could hear. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt, and for some reason, the feeling was comforting. The thought of being in a quiet, untouched place made me feel like I was escaping from the noise of the world. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue over everything. I was in awe of how beautiful the place looked. The dense trees seemed to form a natural barrier, keeping the outside world at bay. The air was cool and crisp, and the forest around me felt untouched, almost sacred. There was a tranquility that washed over me, and I felt as if I had stepped into another world entirely. I set up my tent quickly, eager to settle in before it got too dark. The stillness of the forest surrounded me. There were no sounds of animals, no birds chirping, nothing. It was unnerving, yet strangely calming. The silence seemed to wrap around me, and I found comfort in it. I'd been living in a busy city for years, and I hadn't had a moment of real quiet in months. Once my tent was up, I built a small fire to keep me warm and to ward off the possible chill of the evening. As I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fire's warmth on my skin, the crackling of the logs, and the smell of burning wood all made me feel grounded. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, just some beans and rice, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet around me. The silence of the forest was so profound that it almost felt like I was the only person alive in the world. After eating, I laid back on the ground, looking up at the vast sky. The stars began to appear, and I felt small beneath their brilliance. The night seemed perfect. There was no rush, no obligations, no worries, just me and the forest. But then, the wind started to pick up. At first, I welcomed the cool breeze that made the fire dance and flicker. It was a welcome relief from the heat of the fire, and it made the leaves rustle in the trees. But then, it began to howl, sending the trees swaying violently. The soft whispers of the wind turned into something more sinister, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself that it was just the forest. I had camped before, and it was normal for the wind to get stronger at night. But then, I heard it, the first whisper. It was faint at first, so soft that I thought it was just the wind. The trees creaked and groaned, and the rustling leaves made it hard to distinguish anything else. But as the sound grew clearer, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice that seemed to be speaking right outside my camp. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was clear enough for me to make out the words. "Help me." I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who could be out here with me? Miles away from the nearest town? Was someone lost in the woods? I had heard stories of people getting lost in forests and being unable to find their way out. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe someone was in need of help. My flashlight was on the ground next to me, so I grabbed it and scanned the surrounding area. I looked around the campfire, but there was nothing, just shadows dancing around the trees. The voice had stopped, but the sense of dread lingered in the air. I called out, thinking maybe it was someone in trouble. "Is someone out there?" I shouted, but there was no answer. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. My rational mind told me it was probably just an animal or a trick of the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The whisper had sounded too human, too real. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my shaking hands, and scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but I saw nothing. The trees were still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. My heart was pounding as I returned to my tent. I climbed in, thinking it was best to sleep and ignore what had happened. I tried to reassure myself that it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. But as soon as I lay down, the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, clearer, and much closer. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, almost mocking, and it sent a chill through my spine. My eyes shot open, my breath catching in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight again and unzipped the tent, trying to peer into the darkness. But there was nothing. No one. The trees were still, the wind had died down, and the world felt too quiet, too still. But the voice, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was as though it was right outside my tent, watching me. I felt a presence. Something unseen, but incredibly real. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe some other camper playing a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig felt like a signal. I was no longer alone. I sat in my tent, not daring to sleep. The air was thick with fear, and every creak of the forest made my heart race. The wind had stopped, but the voices had not. They came again, one after another, circling around me, each one clearer than the last. "Leave before it's too late." The words sounded like they were coming from all directions, surrounding me. My mind was spinning. What was happening? Who was out there? Why was no one else around? The silence was deafening now, broken only by the mysterious whispers that seemed to surround my tent. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt as though the very forest itself was alive, and it was trying to reach me. Suddenly, I heard a noise, footstep, crunching leaves, moving closer to my tent. My heart thudded in my chest as I held my breath, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. The air was thick with tension. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something or someone was there. "Help me." The voice was now a whisper directly against the tent fabric. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. The whispers continued, growing louder, more desperate. I finally gathered enough courage to unzip the tent, but when I did, there was nothing there. Just the stillness of the forest. I stepped outside cautiously, shining my flashlight in every direction. The beam flickered in the darkness, revealing only the silhouettes of trees and shadows. There was no one there, but the whispers persisted in my mind, echoing over and over. "Leave before it's too late." I had never been so scared in my life. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I packed up my tent and threw everything into the car. I didn't care if I was alone in the forest or if it was dark outside. I needed to leave. As I drove away from the campsite, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. The whispers echoed in my ears, growing louder with each passing mile. I kept driving, not daring to stop until I was miles away from that cursed forest. Every inch of me screamed to get as far from the place as possible. My mind raced. What was that? Was it a warning? A curse? Or something far more sinister? But the one thought that stood out more than any other was the certainty that I was never meant to return to that place. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. I don't know if it was a prank, the wind, or something far worse. But one thing is for sure, I will never camp alone again. Every time I pass a forest now, the wind whispers in my ears, and I can't help but wonder what's still out there, waiting for the next person to hear the call of the woods. It was a typical weekend when I decided to visit Hollow Creek. I had heard of the place before, in whispered conversations at work and through some local rumors, but I never thought much of it. People said that Hollow Creek was a cursed village, one where strange things happened, and it was better to stay away from the area after dark. Of course, I didn't believe any of it. I was 25, adventurous, and felt ready to tackle whatever mysteries the world had to offer. As I drove through winding roads that led to the village, I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. The sun had started its descent behind the trees, casting an orange hue across the sky. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The trees on either side of the road were dense, their branches almost touching, and the air grew colder as the daylight faded. I couldn't see much, except for a few scattered houses and rundown barns. The town was small, almost forgotten, nestled deep in the mountains, far away from the hustle and bustle of modern life. A perfect getaway, I thought. I arrived in Hollow Creek just before sunset. The village was exactly how I had imagined it: old, mysterious, and seemingly abandoned. The streets were narrow and lined with ancient buildings that looked like they had been standing for centuries. Some of the houses had boarded-up windows, while others were in such bad condition they barely resembled homes anymore. The few people I did see looked as though they were part of a bygone era, strange, old-fashioned, and seemingly out of place. They didn't speak to me as I passed by. They simply watched, their eyes following me with a peculiar intensity. I didn't mind. After all, I was used to small towns, and their odd ways didn't bother me. I parked my car near the town square, noticing an old stone well in the center. It was cracked, weathered, and appeared to be untouched by time. There was something about it that intrigued me. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, wondering what secrets it might hold. The wind picked up, causing the trees to rustle, and for a second, I felt the unsettling presence of being watched. But I brushed it off. It was just a feeling, I thought, nothing more. As I continued my walk around the village, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. There were no sounds of children playing, no laughter in the streets. Even the birds seemed to be silent. I came across several abandoned houses, the paint peeling off their walls, their windows broken and empty. Some of the homes had faded, yellowed photographs hanging in the windows, staring out into the desolate streets. It felt as if the village was frozen in time, stuck in a perpetual state of decay. Around dusk, I found my way to the inn, which was one of the only buildings that seemed relatively intact. The door creaked open as I entered, and the smell of aged wood and dust hit me immediately. The innkeeper, an older man with a weathered face and a deep, gravelly voice, greeted me with a nod. He seemed kind enough, but also oddly distant. He handed me the key to my room, along with a piece of advice I couldn't quite understand at the time. "Don't wander too far after dark," he said, his voice low, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "It's best to stay close to the inn when night falls." I smiled politely, brushing off his warning as simple caution, but I couldn't help but feel an underlying sense of unease. Why was he so insistent? Was there something more to Hollow Creek than I had anticipated? I shrugged it off, told myself it was just small-town superstition, and went to my room to unpack. As night fell, I found myself restless. The room was dark and small, with an old wooden bed and a single window that overlooked the town square. The air felt thick with the weight of the past, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The streets of Hollow Creek were quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. I walked past the old well again, its stone walls now bathed in the light of the moon. The village was cast in an eerie glow, the shadows of the trees stretching across the ground like dark fingers reaching out to grab me. As I approached the well, I felt a strange pull toward it. The air grew colder, and the silence was almost deafening. I stood there for a long time, staring into the depths of the well. The stone wall seemed to twist and shift, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving deep within, but it was too dark to make anything out. It was as if the well itself was alive, watching me. That's when I heard it, a faint voice, coming from the depths of the well, whispering so softly that I almost didn't hear it. "Help me." My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I looked around, but there was no one there. The street was completely empty. No one was watching me. The village seemed even more desolate in the moonlight, the shadows stretching across the ground like dark, empty veins. "Help me." The voice came again, louder this time, filled with desperation. It was a man's voice, but it sounded weak, as though the speaker had been trapped for a long time. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the words echoed in my mind. I looked at the well again, my heart pounding. Something was wrong. The voice was real, and it was coming from the well. I quickly walked back to the inn, my mind racing. What had I heard? Was it a prank? Some kind of trick? Or was there something more sinister lurking in the village? My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door of my room. I locked it behind me, trying to calm myself, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voice again, faint but persistent, echoing in my mind. "Help me." The next morning, I barely slept. I woke up to the sounds of the village, but it felt different. The silence of Hollow Creek was heavier, as if something had changed overnight. The innkeeper didn't say anything when I came downstairs, but I could tell that he knew what I had heard. He watched me with an almost pitying look, but said nothing. He handed me my breakfast and nodded toward the door. "You might want to leave," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You've heard it now. There's no going back." His words hung in the air like a cloud, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. I had to know more. I couldn't just leave now. Something was drawing me back to that well. Ignoring the innkeeper's warning, I walked toward the town square again. This time, the streets felt colder, more oppressive. The village seemed even quieter, if that was possible. As I approached the well, the voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. "Please, help me." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to know who was calling. I had to know what was happening in this cursed village. I leaned over the well, peering into the darkness. The air was thick with tension, and I felt the overwhelming urge to reach into the depths. Without thinking, I pulled my phone out, taking a picture of the well to capture the moment. The flash illuminated the stone walls, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, a figure, dark and formless, rising from the depths of the well. It wasn't human. It was something darker, something ancient. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled back, dropping my phone. But the figure didn't stop. It reached out with long, bony fingers, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The voice grew louder, now screaming in anguish. Leave now. I turned and ran, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the inn, where I collapsed onto the doorstep, gasping for breath. The innkeeper was standing at the door, watching me with a mixture of pity and understanding. "You've seen it now," he said, his voice solemn. "You heard the voice. The curse has claimed you." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't stay to find out. I grabbed my things and left Hollow Creek without another word. As I drove away, I looked back at the village one last time. The fog had settled in, and the old stone well stood there, silent and waiting. To this day, I can still hear the voice in my head, calling out from the depths of that cursed well, "Help me." I'll never forget what I saw that night, and I'll never return to Hollow Creek. Some places are better left undisturbed. When I was a child, my grandmother used to tell me stories about a haunted house in her village, a place no one dared to enter. Her voice would drop to a whisper as she described flickering lights, ghostly laughter, and doors that creaked open on their own. I remember being terrified yet fascinated, my young mind torn between disbelief and curiosity. Little did I know that years later, I would stumble upon a place that felt like one of her stories come to life. Rosewood Manor. Nestled at the edge of a sleepy village, Rosewood Manor loomed like a shadow from the past. Its massive stone walls were wrapped in ivy, its cracked windows staring out like tired, hollow eyes. The mansion seemed to bow under the weight of its age, its former grandeur buried beneath years of neglect. To the villagers, it was more than an abandoned house. It was a place of whispers, shivers, and unspoken fears. The stories about Rosewood Manor were endless. They spoke of eerie sounds echoing in the dead of night, lights flickering in the empty halls, and voices carried by the wind's soft, chilling murmurs that no one could explain. Generations had passed down these tales, and the manor became the backdrop of every ghost story told in hushed tones around crackling fires. Most villagers stayed far away, especially after sunset, but I had always been different. Where others saw danger, I saw curiosity. Where they whispered, I questioned. Perhaps that's why, when I moved to this quiet village to escape the chaos of city life, Rosewood Manor drew me in like a magnet. I came to the village seeking peace, a fresh start after years of stress and noise. The serene hills, the lush forests, and the friendly locals made it feel like a sanctuary. Life here moved slowly, offering a kind of simplicity I'd long forgotten. But amid the calm and beauty, my attention kept drifting back to the mansion at the edge of the woods. From my cottage window, I could see its silhouette framed against the twilight sky, a dark and imposing figure standing defiantly against time. The more I heard about it, the more it pulled at my thoughts. What was it about Rosewood Manor that inspired so much fear? Were the stories exaggerated, or was there some truth lurking in the shadows of its walls? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, I made a decision. I couldn't let the mystery remain unsolved. I had to see the manor for myself. The manor had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Its once beautiful gardens were now overgrown with wild plants, and the large iron gate had rusted and fallen off its hinges. The roof was caved in at one corner, and the windows, many of them broken, revealed only darkness inside. Despite its decay, the mansion remained an imposing figure in the landscape, a monument to a time long past. It was clear that no one had lived there for years, yet it seemed to possess an eerie presence, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had heard the stories, of course, tales of people who had wandered too close and heard whispers on the wind, of strange lights that flickered in the windows late at night, and of footsteps heard from inside when no one was around. Some said that the house was haunted by the spirits of its former owners, while others believed that something darker was at play. But, despite all the rumors, I was determined to see the place for myself. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural forces. I thought that the strange happenings were simply the result of a forgotten house and the imaginations of the people who lived nearby. One crisp evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in a golden-orange hue. I decided to take a walk through the woods. I had heard that there was a hidden path that led directly to Rosewood Manor, and I couldn't resist the temptation to explore. It was late afternoon when I left my cottage, and I thought I would return before nightfall. But the allure of the manor and the stories surrounding it had taken hold of my curiosity, and I found myself walking deeper into the forest than I had intended. The path was narrow and overgrown, almost as if it had been forgotten by time. The trees loomed over me like ancient sentinels, their branches twisting and tangling together to form a canopy that blocked out the last rays of sunlight. The further I ventured, the quieter it became. The birds, which had been chirping merrily just a few moments ago, were silent now, and the wind seemed to have died down. All that remained was the sound of my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath my feet. As I walked, a strange feeling began to settle over me. It was subtle at first, like a slight tension in the air, but it soon grew stronger. The quietness was unnerving. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, as though it were waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. After all, I was on a path that led to an old mansion, a place that was bound to stir up strange thoughts. But the unease continued to grow. Eventually, I reached the edge of the forest, and there, standing before me, was Rosewood Manor. It looked even more imposing up closely. The tall, iron gate was twisted and broken, and the front door, though slightly ajar, seemed to invite me in. The mansion's stone walls were covered in ivy, and the windows, many of them cracked, gave the building an even more sinister appearance. There was no light in the house, no sign of life, but I could almost feel the weight of its history pressing down on me. The air around the manor felt thick, charged with some sort of energy, and for the first time, I began to feel a deep sense of foreboding. Despite the dread I felt, my curiosity won out. I stepped forward, my feet dragging with each step as I approached the front door. The house seemed to whisper to me, urging me to enter. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The interior of the mansion was dark and cold, the air thick with dust and the musty scent of decay. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I could hear the faint sound of something scurrying in the walls. The silence inside the house was unnerving, and every step I took echoed in the emptiness. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and the furniture, though once grand, was now covered in layers of dust. Broken mirrors hung crookedly on the walls, their reflective surfaces cracked, giving the room an unsettling appearance. I made my way through the hallways, drawn deeper into the house. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on me. The house was heavy with history, but there was also something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A chill ran down my spine as I passed by a large portrait of a woman hanging on the wall. Her eyes, painted in exquisite detail, seemed to follow me as I moved, and I had to force myself not to look back at it. I reached the grand staircase that led to the upper floors. The steps creaked ominously as I ascended, and my heart began to race. The whispers that had been faint earlier now seemed to surround me, growing louder and more urgent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the closer I got to the top, the more distinct the voices became. "Go away!" It was a soft whisper, almost drowned out by the creaking of the staircase. But it was unmistakable. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. The house was empty. I continued up the stairs, my legs trembling with each step. As I reached the top, the whispering grew louder, and I could hear the words more clearly. "Leave this place." I turned down a dark hallway, following the sound of the voice. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. The whispering was now a constant murmur, urging me to stop, to leave, to turn around. But I couldn't. Something in me was drawn to the room beyond. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracked windows. Dust hung in the air, and the furniture, once elegant, was now decaying and broken. But it was the mirror on the far wall that caught my attention. It was large, framed in dark wood, its surface covered in grime. But as I stepped closer, something changed. The air in the room grew colder, and the reflection in the mirror seemed to shift. At first, I saw myself standing in the room, looking back at the mirror. But as I blinked, the reflection shifted. I was still there, but behind me, in the mirror, there was something else. A tall, dark figure stood in the shadows, watching me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, the air thick with silence. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. I felt dizzy, unsure of what I had just seen. It was as if the room itself was playing tricks on me. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, and I turned to leave the room. But the whispering had returned, louder than ever. Now, it was no longer just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. Leave, leave now. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the weight of the voices pressing on me, urging me to leave. I ran, my feet pounding against the creaking floors as I made my way back down the stairs. The house seemed to close in on me, its walls narrowing as I rushed toward the front door. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more desperate, as if the house itself was trying to stop me from leaving. I didn't stop running until I was far from the manor, my heart racing in my chest. The house was silent now, but I knew it was watching me, waiting for me to return. The whispering had followed me all the way out, lingering in my ears even as I stood at a distance. I never went back to Rosewood Manor after that night. I don't know what I encountered there, whether it was the spirits of the past or something darker, but I knew one thing for sure: Rosewood Manor was not a place to be taken lightly. Some houses were better left undisturbed, their secrets hidden away in the shadows, where they belong. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the world is silent, I hear the whispers again. They call to me from the shadows, urging me to return. But I know better now. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. There is a lake in the small town of Windshire that no one dares to visit anymore. The locals call it the Vanishing Lake because every few years, the water simply disappears. One day, the lake is full of shimmering water, sparkling under the sun, and the next day, it's completely dry. It's as if the earth swallows it up without a trace. The townspeople don't talk about it much, but those who do speak in hushed voices, fearful of the strange occurrences that happen whenever the lake vanishes. I had grown up hearing the stories of the vanishing lake, and for most of my life, I thought it was just a myth. I assumed it was one of those old legends designed to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. But when I moved to Windshire as an adult, something about the mystery intrigued me. I couldn't help but wonder why no one ever tried to uncover the truth. What was really happening to the lake? The first time I saw the lake, I was taken aback by its beauty. It sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods. The water was calm, like a mirror reflecting the clear blue sky. The tall, green trees lined the shores, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It looked like the kind of place you could visit to escape from the world, to find peace. But as I gazed at the water, I remembered the stories the lake would disappear, leaving behind nothing but cracked earth, dry and barren. I was determined to see for myself whether the legend was true. I had heard that the lake had just vanished again, leaving the town in a state of confusion. Curiosity burned inside me, and I decided to visit the lake that very afternoon. The sun was beginning to set as I made my way down the dirt path that led to the water. The trees stood tall on either side, their shadows stretching long across the ground as the evening light faded. When I reached the lake, I stopped dead in my tracks. Where there had once been water, there was now only dry, cracked earth. The shoreline, once lush and green, was now brown and barren. It was as though the lake had been swallowed by the earth, leaving no sign of the water that had once filled it. But what shocked me even more were the strange markings on the ground. In the middle of the dry lake bed were large, circular patterns, like something had been etched into the earth. They looked like they had been carved by hand, and they seemed to radiate from a central point, like the ripples of water moving outward. The ground around the circles was cracked and dry, as though the earth had been disturbed in some way. I bent down to inspect the markings more closely, but the moment my fingers brushed the surface of the earth, a cold chill ran through me. The air around me seemed to grow heavy, and I suddenly felt as if I was being watched. I looked around nervously, but there was no one in sight. The wind had died down, and the forest around me was eerily silent. It was then that I heard a faint sound, a low, distant hum, like a vibration coming from deep within the earth. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath the dry ground, as if something was buried deep below the surface, calling to me. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to run away from the lake before something terrible happened, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my feet frozen in place by an unseen force. The humming grew louder, and then, Without warning, the earth beneath me began to tremble. I stumbled back, my hands outstretched to steady myself, but it felt as if the ground itself was shaking. The markings on the ground began to glow with an eerie light, and the temperature dropped drastically. I could see my breath in the cold air, even though it was still a warm evening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lake bed was still. The hum faded away, and the temperature returned to normal. The markings on the ground were no longer glowing, and the lake bed seemed to have returned to its barren, dry state. But I knew something had changed. I could feel it deep in my bones. Something was different now. The mystery of the lake was no longer just a story. It was real. I quickly turned and ran back toward the town, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just discovered something ancient, something dangerous, but I had no idea what it was or what to do next. All I knew was that I had to find out more. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with learning about the lake and the strange events that surrounded it. I spoke to the townspeople, but they were tight-lipped. Some of them seemed genuinely frightened of the lake, while others simply dismissed it as a natural phenomenon. But one old man, Mr. Thompson, seemed to know more than he was willing to say. He had lived in Shire his entire life and had witnessed the lake vanish more times than he could count. "I don't know what it is," Mr. Thompson said one evening as we sat on a bench near the town square. "But I do know this: the lake has been here for as long as anyone can remember, and every time it disappears, it takes something with it. People have disappeared, animals have vanished, and no one knows why. Some folks say the lake has a mind of its own, that it's somehow alive, but I don't know if I believe that. All I know is that something's been going on there for years, and it's not something we can explain." I could see the fear in his eyes, and I knew he wasn't lying. The stories were true. Something was happening to that lake, and whatever it was far more than just a mysterious disappearing act. Determined to uncover the truth, I went back to the lake. This time, I wasn't alone. I brought along a local historian, a young woman named Emily, who had studied the history of Shire. She was skeptical at first, but after hearing Mr. Thompson's stories, she agreed to join me on my investigation. We arrived at the lake late at night, just as the moon was rising. The lake bed was dry, as it had been before, but Emily and I were determined to find some answers. We spent hours carefully searching the area, but it wasn't until we reached the center of the lake bed that we made our discovery. There, buried beneath the dry earth, we found an ancient stone. It was large and heavy, covered in moss and dirt, and had strange markings carved into its surface. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They looked like a form of writing, but the language was foreign to me. Emily, who had studied ancient scripts, gasped when she saw it. "This isn't just a stone," she said, her voice trembling. "This is a marker, a warning. And these symbols, they're old, really old." We realized that the lake's mysterious disappearances were connected to the stone. It seemed that every time the lake vanished, the earth beneath it revealed this ancient marker, as if something was being awakened. But what was it, and what did it mean? As we continued to examine the stone, the ground beneath us began to tremble again. The humming sound returned, louder this time. We looked at each other in terror as the earth shook violently. The air grew thick with energy, and I felt as though something was pulling me toward the stone. Then, just as before, the shaking stopped. The lake bed was still, and the humming faded away. But we both knew that whatever force was at work here, it was beyond our understanding. The lake had revealed its secret, but it wasn't finished with us yet. We left Shire that night, not knowing what would happen next, but one thing was clear: the vanishing lake was not just a legend. It was a warning, and whatever lay beneath it, we were not meant to uncover. There's a legend that has been whispered in my town for as long as I can remember. It's a story that no one talks about openly, but everyone knows it. And if you ask the wrong person, you might see the fear in their eyes. The legend speaks of a man who lives in the forest, a man with no face, known only as the Hollow Man. And the curse he carries is said to be passed on to anyone who dares to set foot in his domain. I had heard the stories ever since I was a child, but I never truly believed them. I grew up in a small town called Brooksville, nestled on the edge of a vast forest that stretched for miles. The forest was dark and full of secrets, and as kids, we dared each other to go into the woods at night, but we always turned back long before we got too deep. The adults in the town always warned us to stay away from certain parts of the forest. They would tell us stories of the Hollow Man and how he could steal your soul if you crossed his path. As a kid, I never gave it much thought. It was just a story, a way for the adults to keep us from wandering too far into the forest. After all, the forest was dangerous, even without the legends surrounding it. But as I grew older, I began to notice that there was something different about the forest. There was a certain stillness to it, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake whenever I went near it. It was as though the trees themselves were watching me. I had heard about people who had disappeared into those woods over the years. Their bodies were never found, and there were no real explanations as to why they vanished. The town was always quick to chalk it up to wild animals, or maybe just poor navigation, but I always felt that there was something more to it, something that no one wanted to talk about. It was one evening when I was in my early 20s that the thought of the Hollow Man crept into my mind again. I had been drinking with friends at the local pub when someone mentioned the forest. They spoke about it casually, but I could hear the unease in their voices. It was as if the mention of the Hollow Man had put a strange weight in the room. For the first time, I started to wonder if the legends were more than just stories. I had always prided myself on being a skeptic, never one to believe in ghosts or curses. So, that night, I decided to challenge the stories I had heard my whole life. I would go into the woods, alone, and see for myself if there was any truth to the tale of the Hollow Man. After all, how could a faceless man be real? It was just another ghost story, right? The next evening, I gathered my things, just the basics: flashlight, a knife for safety, some water, and a few snacks, and set out early, as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The walk to the forest's edge was familiar to me. I had done it countless times before, walking along the old trail that led into the heart of the woods. I didn't feel scared at first. In fact, I felt exhilarated. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the chance to prove the stories wrong. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, the air began to change. The temperature dropped, and the trees, which had once seemed welcoming, now felt oppressive, their limbs reaching out like claws. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the deeper I went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the chill in the air, it was something more primal, something that seemed to be watching me from the shadows. The path I had been following quickly disappeared, swallowed by the thick underbrush. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't care. I pressed on, driven by my curiosity and a strange compulsion to uncover the truth. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing thicker, the undergrowth more tangled. The path became more difficult to navigate, but still, I pressed on, hoping to find some sign of the Hollow Man's domain. As night fell, the forest became even darker. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of leaves above me, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The sounds of the forest, which had seemed comforting at first, now grew louder and more menacing. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl, all of it seemed amplified, as if the forest itself were alive and aware of my every move. I had been walking for what felt like hours, but I couldn't tell. The darkness was absolute, and I was lost. The sense of unease had grown into a gnawing fear. Every step I took felt like it was drawing me deeper into something I couldn't escape. I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. And then, I saw it. Through the trees, I noticed a faint glow. It was soft, almost ethereal, and it drew me in. At first, I thought it might be a campfire, but there was no smoke, no warmth. It was simply a light flickering in the distance. The further I walked, the stronger the pull became, and soon I found myself moving toward it, almost without thinking. As I drew closer, the light grew brighter, and I could make out the shape of a figure standing in the clearing. It was tall and thin, its back turned to me, and it stood perfectly still. At first, I thought it was just another person, someone lost like me. But as I approached, a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I stopped a few feet away, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know why, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the figure in front of me. It was as though I couldn't pull my eyes away. My pulse raced, and my hands began to tremble. And then, the figure turned. The moment it did, my blood turned cold. There was no face. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was nothing. Just smooth, featureless skin. The space where a face should have been was an empty void, as if someone had erased every detail of its features, leaving only a blank, lifeless surface. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled backward, horrified. The figure didn't move, but it seemed to be watching me. I could feel it, even though there was no face to look at. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, locked in place by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The figure didn't speak at first. It simply stood there, staring into the space where my eyes should have been. It was as though it was waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And then, in a voice that sent shivers down my spine, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said, low and cold. I could barely breathe. I wanted to speak, to ask who it was, what it wanted, but the words wouldn't come. The figure didn't move. It didn't make any other sound, except for the echo of its chilling words ringing in my mind. "You have disturbed my rest," it continued, its voice almost like a whisper, but deep and resonant. "And now, you must pay the price." I couldn't take it anymore. My legs finally gave way, and I fell to the ground. I crawled backward, struggling to breathe, to think. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. Nothing made sense. The figure took a step forward. My heart skipped a beat. "No," I whispered, trembling. "No, please leave me alone." But the figure continued to move toward me. It raised its hand, and I could see the long, twisted fingers, like dead branches, reaching for me. It was as though the figure was drawing closer, closing the distance between us with an unnatural speed. I wanted to scream, to run, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed by fear, my body unresponsive. The hollow man reached out, and I felt the cold air around me freeze. His hand moved toward my face, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The clearing was empty. I opened my eyes cautiously. The forest around me was still. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. The eerie glow was gone. There was no trace of the hollow man, but I could still feel his presence, lingering in the air, as though he was still watching me. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I turned and ran as fast as I could, pushing through the thick underbrush, stumbling over rocks and roots. I didn't stop until I was out of the forest, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. My mind was reeling, and I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. But one thing was certain: I had encountered the hollow man. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? The fear in the hollow man's eyes, the emptiness where his face should have been, those images haunted me for weeks. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight, and I knew that the curse of the hollow man had followed me. Now, every time I walk near the forest, I can still feel his eyes on me. I know I will never be free of him. The hollow man never forgets, and once you've crossed into his domain, there's no escaping him. And you know what? He's waiting for you, too. So, if you want to see or hear more horror stories like this, our channel is always here to bring you more thrilling content. All we need is a simple comment from you under this video, letting us know which story you'd like to hear next. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel right now, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Thanks you.